Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Spiritual Times with me, Philip Solomon, which we broadcast there for you on YouTube every Thursday between 7 and 8. And the subject that I'm looking at tonight is something that's of great interest to me because obviously I think a lot of you, my friends and fans, know that I've always been very involved in music, whether it's singing or playing music. And a lot of special people, very gifted people, have said to me, "Do you think that there's an influence, Philip, from the higher realms in the music that we create?" And my answer is, well, absolutely. I don't think there can be a shadow of a doubt that he influences music. And I'm a massive fan of heavy rock music, and especially heavy metal music. And if you listen to some of the wonderful riffs and solos that you hear some of the guitarists in those sort of bands play, they're very, very similar to the sounds that you might hear in traditional, maybe Native American Indian music or other roots music. Excuse me, I've still got this cold. I do apologise. I've had it now for about 6 weeks and I can't completely get rid of it, but there you go. But yeah, I mean, some of the riffs that you hear those guys play, undoubtedly, in my opinion, show that there's an influence in music from the spiritual realms. But I've made a few notes here for you that you might find interesting and agree with or disagree, of course. That's what learning is all about. And this is what this show is about, is hopefully teaching you and learning something that you might look at in a slightly different way. Music from the spiritual realms, then. Well, it encompasses a wide range of genres and traditions, doesn't it? That aim to connect with something beyond the material world, in my view. The exact sound can differ greatly from meditative instrumentals to powerful vocal traditions, depending on the culture and intent. And I've already said to you my opinion of that. I think certainly, yeah. Breaking it down in very simple terms, I'm sure if you've listened carefully, perhaps to heavy metal music, very often you have a sound which is very similar to what we recognize and know as a Native American beat. There's a dot 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 dot. Not terrible example vocalizing there, but if you think about it, I'm sure you'll know what I mean. And I've been a massive fan of some of those heavy metal bands, Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, and lots of them really. And I think there's a very, very significant influence there from the higher realms. I suppose you would have to speak to the guitarists in that band, Tony Iommi or KK Dan was not with them with Priest now, is he KK Dan? But you could certainly ask him his in opinion. And you've got Glenn and in that band as well, haven't you? A wonderful guitar player, and see what they thought about it. But even bands like the Beatles, they used to talk about the influence that had come from the higher realms, and often people like that would talk about the Muse. What does it mean, the Muse? Well, suddenly lyrics or music that they hadn't really had to mind suddenly comes to mind, and there it is. They play it and they record it, and it's wonderful, isn't it? And I think even they sometimes think where it's come from. Back to those traditions that I talked about, African American spirituals. Well, I suppose they're rooted in the experience of living in slavery, weren't they? These wonderful religious folk songs and people served as a form of protest, community building, and hope. And their examples included Swing Low, Sweet Chariot and Wade in the Water. Definitely spiritual influence in that sort of music, isn't there? And you get spiritual influence in jazz as well. Subgenre, if you like, of jazz from the late 1960s. It, it focused on sort of conveying religious and cosmic themes. And I can think of very famous artists such as John and Alice Coltrane and Pharaoh Sanders. And if you were to look up some of their music and listen to what they produced, I think you might consider that my opinion might be one worth considering that the influence is there from the spiritual realms. It really is. I believe it to be so. But if you look at them again, if you look at the great bands of history, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, all those sort of bands, you could ask. To think of the Kinks, we'll always remember that special sound that Dave Davis brought into the world. I think it's driven loads of rock music and heavy metal music ever since that one. You really got me. You know the music. You know the riff, don't you? I won't vocalise that. Forget my guitar. I'll play it for you, but I'm going to vocalise that. But I mean, where did Dave get that from? I mean, I've been lucky enough to interview Dave a couple of times, and he always says, well, he was just looking for a special sound, and something influenced him to slash the cones, the material cones on the speakers, and link other amplifiers together, and you got a sound that even he wondered where it had come from. So I think that influence is there. Indian called spit my words out. Indian classical music in the Hindu tradition, instruments like the tabla and the sitar are used from mantra chanting during yoga and meditation. Well, that's got to be spiritual, hasn't it? And that's got to be coming from, oh, I believe, from higher realms. Just the same as I spoke right at the start of this lecture about music, from coming from the Native American Indians. If you listen to some of the chants and the sounds of tribes like the Sioux Indians, Lakota Sioux, the Cherokee, the Blackfoot. Of course, there's a band called Blackfoot Sioux, isn't there? There you go. There you go. They must be influenced in their name as well. I don't know about that. Of course, I'm just dropping that one in there. But certainly, it's there and you can't really get away from it, really. But some of the wonderful Indian classic music, as I say, the tabla, the sitar, they're played and used alongside the mantras that those people chant when they're bringing themselves into the meditative state. Or, in things like yoga and things like that, music is very stimulating and it comes from somewhere of an higher understanding and belief. That's what I have anyway. Right. I hope I'm going to pronounce this right. Kwawale, a form of Sufi devotional music performed in South Asia. Its powerful performances aim to lead listeners to a state of spiritual ecstasy. Now, that's what you're probably going to have to look up because I've made a note of it and I've read it, and it certainly seems that those devotees of that particular form of music. They're certainly tuning into something that's from an higher realm, without a shadow of a doubt. Gregorian chants, if you want to look back on those, that originated in the early Roman Catholic Church and still there to this day, aren't they? These unaccompanied religious chants can create a meditative atmosphere. There's no doubt about it. I mean, if you think back, not so very long ago, if you went to the Catholic Church, you couldn't really understand what it was all about because it was all in Latin. And when the chants and the songs and the music, it did something and it swung you along with it. And people kept returning to that faith time and time again into those churches. But not very few of us could read or understand Latin. I suppose if you were in the higher classes at school, you may have learned some Latin, but by and large, most of the people, and I'm sure those people in the poorer parts of the world where the Catholic Church was very prevalent, places like Southern Ireland and places like that, I'm quite sure that the ordinary people would not really have understood any of the Mass, the chanting, and all the rest of it, but they were into it, they were drawn into it, and it meant something to them, didn't they? And I think their life, the proof that, you know, music is spiritual and comes from an higher level and influences us. I mean, if you think of I don't know, we're all I think we're all still quite interested in all the new age stuff that we all were interested, but very much so a few years ago. I think it started to come back really, because the new age will always be the old age, really, won't it? Really, it's they called it the new age, really, but it was based on a lot of old traditions, wasn't it? Really, but if you remember back, there was a prevalence of ambient and new age music that you could buy. Many modern artists create ethereal, relaxing music for world music, and this broad category includes traditional music from cultures around the world, really, from Tibetan singing bowls to the Native American Indian drumming that I've mentioned to you right at the start of this lecture or this talk. But I mean, it's amazing how the Tibetan bowls, when we hear ding and that music resonates. And I suppose I could have used my Indian bowl and done that for you tonight. Couldn't wait, but I suppose I'm really tying it down to something a lot, uh, a lot wider context, really. But I mean, it's certainly there, isn't it? Really. Core characteristics then, what can you think of? While the sounds and traditions are diverse, spiritual music often shares some common elements. Well, I think so. Transcendence. It is designed to take the listener beyond their everyday state of being and into a deeper, much more profound experience. Take you on a journey, if you like, a musical journey, but really maybe presented to you in that ambient way, you might play it. I mean, I can remember when the tapes were coming out of the new age music, and we all had them, didn't we? And I think we found them very interesting. I've played a fair bit of music in my life. And I've sometimes found myself really, especially when I've just got my guitar out and I'm just noodling around there, looking for little riffs and stuff. And all of a sudden I'll get something and I don't know where it's come from. I think, oh, that's interesting. And, I mentioned bands at the start, the heavy metal bands, some quite famous ones, didn't I? Like Black Sabbath and, uh, and Judas Priest, very much guitar riff driven, and to be interested to know what they would say of those sort of things. I mean, I can remember when, you used to have a lot of people say, oh, heavy metal, the Black Sabbath, it was not nice, it was bad music, it was influenced from very, very bad energies and all that sort of stuff. Well, if that's the case, it also proves the case that lots of music comes through and can be influenced from an higher realm, from an higher force, if you like. And to be honest, if you actually listen to the records, really, there's not really that much, really, what you could call evil there, really. I think it's very easy to turn things that are not evil to sound evil. But yeah, I mean, that's just another instance that I make in the core characteristics of music and the spiritual influence that it has over us, in my opinion. Vastness and space. Some spiritual music has a airy or how can you put it, very deep feeling of sorrow and can make you feel very depressed, can't it? Music can do that as well. Some music can lift you up and make you feel very happy, but some music can make you feel very down in the dumps, or otherwise all from the same wherever it comes from, it can really make you feel very, very happy in yourself and inspire you. I don't think there's anyone out there who couldn't think if you spent enough time, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes thinking about it, where you wouldn't agree that there's a certain piece of music that you've suddenly got in your mind, and it's not probably from the Beatles or the Beach Boys or the Rolling Stones, a piece of music, and you've wondered where it comes from. I mean, I think most musicians would agree with me. We all get that. It all happens. And I think most artists as well pick up on that sort of thing. Painters, musicians, poets. I think they too are suddenly inspired from an higher level. I think it could only be described as an higher level. Emotional intensity. It is often emotive and expresses those very deep feelings that make us kind or otherwise. I think there's an old saying, there isn't music calms the wild beast, is it? Something of that nature. And there may be some truth in that, really, because certainly animals, dogs, cats, and many other animals, can hear sounds that us human beings can't hear. You know, it's beyond our hearing, but it doesn't mean to say that it's not there. And if you think that, that I'm talking, well, without a great deal of solidarity to what I'm suggesting, if you have a dog and you have a whistle, within a few days, if you whistle, that's, a little referee's whistle or a penny whistle, something like that, even the very highest or very deepest sounds that you can't hear, that dog will, or other animals will, because they have a very developed sense of hearing. And I do believe that that is also a very spiritual thing. I think that comes on a spiritual level with the animals. Hidden meanings in some cases, such as with African American spirituals that I talked about earlier on. The lyrics may contain coded messages with deeper meaning related to the liberation or protest. Now, if you think of those poor people who were in slavery, they couldn't really just talk about what they were hearing or what they sensed, could they really? Because their slavers wouldn't allow it. And they'd have what they call, and it's in music as well, what I'm going to say now, that what they have call and response. And that's very prevalent in rock and roll music. Almost all blues songs or rock and roll music of that type has a call, a responding call sound to it. And it's there, isn't it? You think of some of the very deeper music as well. I suppose the Beatles were very much into that sort of music. George Harrison, lovely spiritual man, George. Not perfect in life. He had his faults like all of us, but a very deeply spiritual man who spent all his life really looking for spiritual guidance, and he certainly believed in the music, didn't he, of the mystical world. Together a playlist, a particular, try, put together a list, if you like, or a collection of sounds that you can just think of yourself when you're quiet and just hum them. If you've got one of these little type machines, little type recorder, whenever you get a sound in your mind, or I'd call it a little riff that could turn into a solo, but you know what I mean. If you just hum that song on your tape recorder, you might find that you could be, quite able to get music from the higher realms, if you like. I'm sure that you could. How about we start with some influential artists or albums to get a feel for the different sounds? That would be a good idea. Devotion or love meditations, healing and mindfulness often incorporate frequencies. But what I would suggest to you, if you've got some, LPs or music from famous people, and it's a little got a little bit more what you might call the thinking to it, if you like, a little bit more deep in thinking to it. Listen to it and hear some of the sounds that you've never really heard before. You've just heard the music. I think that's probably quite true again with famous rock bands. I think if you some of the music of Led Zeppelin, if you like, group like that, and you hear some of the songs that they played, and certainly I think John Bonham in that band, he played very heavily, didn't he, and very very sort of inspirational. I've never heard anyone play as heavy as that. I've heard drummers who were on a par generally, or maybe different levels, but certainly he had a very strong, driven emphasis coming through to him for his drumming. Played a very important part. But if you play some, not just, I'm just throwing bands off the top of my head for you that you might like to think about, but listen to and play the tracks that you don't know so well, and you might find that you think, yeah, I'm hearing something there that I didn't hear before, because we don't always hear everything we do. When you play a piece of music, we only hear part of it. And of course, there's probably music that's happening in that's beyond our level of hearing. But you can learn and teach yourself to listen a little bit more carefully to music. And you may come to the same conclusion as I do, that music is spiritual and a lot of it comes from an influence of higher levels. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that tonight, a little bit different from what we normally perhaps would talk about. But so many people have asked me about that, what I think of music and its influence on a spiritual level. Is it there, or is it just something that we enjoy and makes our life more pleasant? It could be so, but quite often we find that diverse music influences individuals, doesn't it? Of course, the popular artists, they have something because their songs, their records are bought in their millions, thousands, and many people find that is all they need to consider about with music. But I think, as I say, if you listened a little bit deeper, and perhaps you tried that little exercise that what I've suggested. I mean, if you are a musician and you can play an instrument, so much the better. Do what I do. Have a little noodle about on the guitar and see what you can find, some little riffs, have a little tape recorder and record it. Yeah, I think you would be very surprised, most of you, by what you would find you could pick up very easily. It's interesting because I think sometimes it can be very hard, can't it, when you're learning a piece of music? And I mean, we have so much easier ways today to learn songs, don't we, than we had back, back in the day, but perhaps the 50s, 60s, even into the 70s. We didn't have the computers and the easy ways of learning about music that we have today. And even today, if you want to learn a song and you've got to find somebody who can show you where every note is, say on the guitar, and you've got to learn it and practice it several times over till it goes in the brain, and then you can just play it naturally. So, there are two sides to it. Maybe we do learn music in that way, but I also believe that we learn it on an unconscious level, and it can be very meaningful and part of our development. Well, thank you for joining me this evening on Spiritual Times with Philip Solomon. I hope you can join me every Thursday, 7 till 8, and keep sending through your suggestions to me of what you would like me to address. Quite a few people have asked me about this. I've got a lot of friends in rock and roll, some very famous ones, and some not so. And it's interesting to talk to them. You ask them about the Muse. I mean, I've been very, very lucky in my life. As I say, I've got to interview incredibly famous musicians and singers, and I've been able to talk to them. Sometimes not on camera or on mic, if it's been like that. But if I've had the opportunity to spend a bit of time talking to them, they all know about the Muse, and they'll all tell you that certain songs they believe has come from somewhere that they're not at all sure where it come from. So I think that's a nice place to leave it and to hopefully get you thinking a little bit more about music from the spiritual realms. And I hope you'll join me again, same place, same time, not next Thursday, for Spiritual Times with Philip Solomon. And again, if there's anything that you would like me to talk about that you think would be interesting for the listeners, please do, and we'll certainly do that with you. Good night, and God bless one and all.